right, welcome everybody to Kevin's session. We are going to give everyone just a couple minutes to get over here. So while we do that, we are going to have some trivia. Okay, so to get things rolling, we're going to ask a couple of trivia questions. The first one to answer correctly in the chat will receive a CUGC cooler. To answer the question, use the chat box, not the Q&A box, please. And you will find the chat widget below on your screen. Just click the chat button and go ahead and open that now so you're ready. Here we go. Ooh, this is a good one. What city was the first Arbor Day held? See some answers coming in here. And the answer is Nebraska City. So that was, I think, maybe it was Chris, but I'm not sure. Someone will make sure they get the right one. Keep scrolling too fast for me. Okay, we have one more question. What state produces the most honey? And just waiting for some answers to come in here. Goodness, it goes so fast. Oh, I saw someone get the answer there. The answer is North Dakota. All right, thanks for participating with the trivia. So next we are going to hear from ControlUp and their latest solutions. So ControlUp, take it away.
A user has an issue. ControlUp can get a screenshot of the user session to give you visibility. This user is having issues, and I'd like to troubleshoot in their session using their rights. We can start a command prompt to troubleshoot further. Security restrictions prevent us from starting the command prompt. Instead of messing with group policy objects, we can remove the session's group policy settings, and now we can start a command prompt to continue troubleshooting. The prompt is now available to walk the user through some troubleshooting steps. Once complete, we can reapply group policy with ControlUp. We have a Citrix user who put in a ticket having poor user experience. There are multiple sessions. We can start a chat with specific sessions to ensure this is the correct one. The high-level session metrics look good. Let's drill into the session and see the session processes. Sorting by CPU, we don't see anything on the Citrix side that it's causing experience degradation. Most troubleshooting tools would stop here, but not ControlUp. The end user is on an iGel device being monitored by ControlUp. ControlUp has full visibility into iGel devices. We'll tell ControlUp to navigate to the device in the console. Immediately, we can see the iGel device has high CPU utilization. However, the processes view and ControlUp highlight the root cause. WebKit web process is consuming significant resources. This process started after a recent change to turn on browser content redirection. Knowing the root cause, the admins can now work on fixing this problem. ControlUp is an excellent tool for managing your infrastructure. For example, if you select a group of infrastructure machines, you can live audit and baseline your Windows Update patches. By selecting Manage Programs and Updates and expanding Updates, then expanding Microsoft Windows, ControlUp shows you all the patches applied and any differences between the machines in a color-coded display. Metadata on the compared machines is available by clicking on a patch. To save the report on your current patch state, click Export in the upper left. ControlUp's controller engine makes it a snap to see inconsistencies in your infrastructure. But ControlUp doesn't stop there. By expanding the ControlUp console with script actions, we can list all available or approved Windows updates. In addition, the script action can also apply updates. ControlUp's grouping engine takes the output of the available Windows updates and shows you which machines require different patches. By clicking Export on the ControlUp Script Actions result window, you can now have a complete report of patches applied and patches available. Access Solve from within ControlUp by clicking on the Solve tab and then clicking on the Solve button. This will launch ControlUp Solve, a web-based version of the ControlUp real-time console. The landing page is a high-level dashboard view, perfect for any administrator, help desk, or NOC. There are 3 dashboards available, one showing user experience metrics, one showing resource consumption, and one showing all combined metrics. Switching to Discovery View, and we have drilled into our environment for the first time. The Discovery View has a new dynamic topology bar showing your environment as clickable logical resources. Underneath is a graph view showing the aggregate of the metrics, and lastly, underneath is the real-time grid view. The classic ControlUp tree is available by clicking the Open Tree button. Just like the console today, you can click on a folder to focus the main display on those objects. Columns have been given new capabilities. Filters can be applied on a per-column basis. Here, we'll show only machines with more than 50% memory utilization. There's also a search box with free text queries. The display of the grid can be customized. The grid can be expanded to show more items by hiding the aggregate graphs. Expand it further to grid-only view, maximizing viewing of the number of simultaneous objects. Columns can be added, removed, rearranged, and the grid density can be selected between default, comfortable, and compact. Now, the real-time view is great, but what if you want to glance at what happened yesterday? Within Solve, we tie into ControlUp Insights, and we can pull recent historical data. Recent historical data goes back up to 3 days. Metrics with an Expand option will show you some additional metrics for a quick historical glance. In this view, historical data can be shown for up to 1 month ago. Try ControlUp for free at www.controlup.com.
All right. Awesome stuff there from our sponsor, ControlUp. Thank you. So now I would like to introduce Kevin Nardone, a senior architect with Citrix. He will be sharing his knowledge about Citrix on Azure and enterprise scale landing zones. Kevin, take it away.
Thank you very much, and looking forward to going through this conversation with everybody. But a little bit about myself. I'm one of the enterprise architects on our America's Customer Success team, so I've had a chance to work with essentially many of you on the phone when it comes to just aligning business needs to technology strategy. So for example, hey, we need to shift a use case to public cloud. We need to focus on reducing costs of DR, essentially with Azure. So looking forward to walking you all through some of the lessons learned in key design methodology that I've been able to pick up working with Citrix and Azure over the last 5 or 6 years. So getting into what we're hoping to learn today, really just kind of kick things off with just kind of a reiteration of some of the value and benefits of Citrix in Microsoft Windows Virtual Desktop, then getting into some of the methodology, especially using Microsoft's cloud adoption framework to transition Citrix workloads from on-prem to Azure, as well as lessons learned when it comes to creating affordable VDI, as well as Azure landing zone design. To kind of shape the conversation today, one great reference I recommend everyone following up from the session today to really kind of dig into is Microsoft's cloud adoption framework. So the cloud adoption framework, especially for a lot of those on the phone who maybe been working with Citrix for a good bit of time, is very similar to Virtual Desktop Handbook that we had some years back, and things like TextZone as well on the Citrix side. It really does walk through an end-to-end methodology of shifting your organization to Azure, from the platform level to individual apps such as Citrix, and transitioning that to the public cloud. So I'd like to leverage at Microsoft's methodology, especially if all of you are looking and working through platform change and migration, and Citrix happens to be the first use case that you're moving to Azure, having like a great understanding of Microsoft's methodology in addition to ours can really help you shepherd your organization when it comes to being the first use case that's going to the cloud, especially for things like VDI, apps, et cetera. So as we talk through today, most of where we're going to focus when it comes to like the phases of the adoption framework is most likely in the plan and ready stage. But we're going to walk through each of the phases at least at a high level, so you have a good understanding of, maybe based on where you are as an organization, where do you fit in, where should you kind of double click down if you want to dig through this as a follow-up. But then also, like if you're in the planning phase, things to look out for on the Citrix side, or the ready phase as you're building out your Citrix landing zone, some of the tips and tricks we typically recommend for executing that. So starting off with strategy, especially when we're talking through and working with other customers on like what's driving them, what are some of the common cloud motivations of adopting Azure and adopting Citrix workloads. A lot of ones are critical business events. So thinking back on the pandemic, especially the need of rapid infrastructure agility, bringing everyone working from home, or potentially a compelling event around like a data center exit. I've worked with a lot of customers where they're using a colo, contracts coming up. Let's shift this over to a public cloud, and start leveraging the agility and ability to kind of better modify, refactor applications and reduce costs, especially when it comes to having to maintain and leverage that colo. Other things are also migration triggers. I think a big one is also like DR, especially as people look at like cost savings, for example. Hey, we have this data center that's been predominantly unused. We spend millions of dollars on this DR data center. Let's look at a way to potentially just offload that, leverage cloud so we can kind of use the capacity as we need it. Others are very common around business agility. A very common trend now, especially when it comes to moving Citrix workloads or like kicking off a public cloud initiative, is like, hey, we have these contractors, we're all remote, no one's coming to the office, and we need to make sure we secure how they're accessing. For example, maybe they're using an unmanaged device with a VPN. Move away from that paradigm and start doing something more secure, centralizing their VDI within Azure Data Center, et cetera. Also like innovation, thinking of like outside of even like Citrix applications themselves, maybe there's some legacy application. Like for example, if you're in like refining space or like an insurance space that, you built this monolithic app and you're looking at transforming that when it comes to cloud PaaS services. And we need a front end that needs to be delivered from Azure using something like Citrix so we can deliver it securely. Meeting, new geographies, for example, for mergers and acquisitions, we want to expand from the American market into the European market. And rather than standing up a new data center, let's just spin up some capacity within an Azure, for example, to meet that need. So a lot of these are common trends that bring organizations to public cloud, some of which may be resonating with a few of the folks on the phone, whether it be some of my colleagues at Citrix or some of my customers that I happen to work with fairly frequently. A few of these may sound familiar, or for those on the phone who are sitting in this session, hey, we have this business challenge, how can we solve it? And as we kind of look through, especially when it comes to the Citrix and Microsoft partnership, a lot of where we align with Microsoft, especially building off of a Windows Virtual Desktop, is around risk mitigation. Thinking of like where you are on-prem today, it's not going to just go to cloud overnight. Or maybe, for example, you may have workloads or use cases that sit in other clouds. Like, hey, our data analytics is predominantly being driven out of Google, or it may have web infrastructure running out of AWS. Mitigating the risk of the unknown, and especially when it comes to the hybrid cloud nature of Citrix, you're able to do that. Another piece, especially when it comes to high-level value of Citrix and Microsoft, is the cost reduction. Thinking of the way we do load balancing when it comes to not just sessions, but CPU memory-based, having something more built in from an auto-scale standpoint, have more robust troubleshooting tools. You can optimize operations to reduce costs, especially when you use Citrix and WVD together. Another big piece as well is improving user experience, having more granular policy control when it comes to contextual access of security, like some of the contractor use cases I mentioned. And for those on the phone as well, great tech zone article, not going to spend a lot of focus going into each granular piece by piece in terms of some of the capabilities, but definitely wanted to at least bring this to everyone's attention of like some new, articles that kind of walk through some of these value-added capabilities in greater depth. Definitely recommend checking out Citrix Tech Zone and overall like enhancing Windows Virtual Desktop and checking out that article. And just kind of some level setting as well, especially when it comes to the architecture, and maybe those who are not as familiar with Citrix on Azure and how it relates to WVD. Microsoft WVD, predominantly Azure-driven service with, the web components and brokering components managed by Microsoft. Where Citrix fits in is especially like taking over that control plane and giving access to multiple capabilities such as hybrid cloud, auto scale, some of the web. So something that shifts, you're not leveraging the Azure tools when it comes to managing the workloads, you're leveraging the Citrix tools that many of you all may be very well familiar with. From an Azure perspective, when we start getting into landing zone architecture, so you're going to have components that sit within Azure. This could be a bring your own subscription, maybe within your current platform team, or even a Citrix managed subscription, especially if you're looking at something like Citrix Virtual App and Desktop on Azure Standard, for example. But this then also enables the hybrid cloud capability, right? And as we start talking about Azure subscription design, you'll kind of see where we sit within an overall Azure platform, and then also how that connector enables you to bridge not just from your Azure subscription, but also your on-prem data center, especially when we start talking about things like app rationalization and assessing your digital estate. Building off of that, and again, getting into the hybrid cloud, thinking about using existing on-premise workloads, your existing infrastructure, that cloud transition, that transformation, getting out of the data center business, or addressing potentially new DR capacity. Those applications or dependencies, as you go through that planning phase, aren't going to be there overnight. So that's kind of where the hybrid cloud to enable this transition is something that's very valuable. Then getting into the client support, thinking of like that client reach, especially when it comes to things like Raspberry Pi, et cetera, device changing, especially if you're working with new contractors who might have a new form factor, or looking at doing bring your own device and you want to open up some of the additional capabilities around iOS or things along those lines. Client support on the Citrix side and bringing that choice is also a little bit more robust. Next piece as well, as you kind of think of the overall Citrix and Microsoft architecture at a high level, is the multi-cloud. Thinking of different resource locations, just dropping those cloud connectors in other data centers like AWS, et cetera. Next piece as well is also bringing your own identity provider. So thinking of Azure AD being the predominant identity for Windows WVD, if you're an Okta shop or if you're a Ping shop, for example, you want to leverage and utilize that technology for end user logon without having to federate through Azure AD, for example, being able to use an ADC and bring, for example, a current state radius solution when it comes to authentication, or like integrate with direct authentication into Okta for your users, for example, is something that Citrix Cloud can bring to the table as well. Also thinking of SaaS applications, especially when it comes to as you look towards not just Windows workloads. And this is, I think, critical to hit on as well as we get into some app rationalization, applications that are refactored to web. Being able to control and secure those within the same user experience is something that's critical as your organization may go throughout a cloud transformation. But building off of this architecture and just kind of like setting the table as to where like Citrix fits into the Microsoft cloud story, we're going to now start getting into, what does that planning look like? So moving away from that strategy phase into more of like that planning. And one of the first things Microsoft recommends from a planning perspective, digital estate. Going through that is understanding of, okay, my initial use case, let's evaluate that use case. Let's determine the best approach when it comes to those applications that are dependencies within, that call center use case that we're trying to drive better DR, or that contractor use case with developers, what assets are going to be they're going to be using. And they use this concept known as like the 5 R's of rationalization. And as we kind of talk through this, especially getting into how does that map to Citrix technologies, there are 3 main ones of the 5 R's. Rehost, think of this as like a lift and shift of an application asset. Maybe today it's installed within a virtual desktop. It's still going to be installed within that virtual desktop when you get into Azure. Refactoring, for example, is another rationalization concept. We have this front, this backend database, maybe we're going to refactor that backend to leverage more of a platform as a service, but then still leverage, the thick client that we have installed on the Citrix environment as a virtual app. We're still going to utilize that. Or maybe, as we're going through the refactoring process, that's not just going to happen overnight. Let's virtualize that application from on-prem and then deliver it to that virtual desktop. Another piece is retiring. Hey, this asset, we only have like 2 more years on like our current licensing setup. We actually have like a future state solution that we're going to move to, maybe a SaaS application to replace it. Let's leave it as is, but we might need to maintain it over the duration of that migration period. but you know what? We don't want to hold it, like have it, prevent our ability to move forward when it comes to our Citrix environment. Rationalization concepts, especially when it comes to like an overall Citrix architecture and where they fit. Typically, apps that are retired or rehosted, or in the process of being rehosted, may be delivered from on-prem. Hey, we have this main use case that we want to kind of drive towards the cloud. Like, let's not let that be a barrier, especially if it's something we can deliver securely, for example. So one of the biggest things is really, rationalization can take, years, especially if you really try to go, end to end, for example, at once. So starting incrementally, so thinking of that first use case where, that's going to be the driver. Maybe that's what's bringing your organization to Azure initially, with the Citrix as a platform delivering that use case, being the first system that forays into Azure. So starting incrementally and kind of hitting a use case that, one, there's a vested take. So it's not just, a platform team saying, let's go. There's like business alignment. There's, initiatives where it's like, okay, if there's an app dependency, because this is critical to the business, let's resolve that either by hosting it on-prem or we prioritize it for a rehosting or refactoring effort. And then using tools, especially like, leading to this session, like Control Up, to inventory your assets, or like pulling information from Director and like, let's take a look and see, what is this use case actually using? We've gone through and we think we know, but like, let's make sure we run an inventory of it using, again, like monitoring systems you may have in Citrix Director, et cetera. And then thinking of those areas where there might be gaps. This is kind of where the hybrid cloud capability can be valuable, is use Citrix app virtualization where it makes sense, especially if there's latency sensitivity for, say, for example, an app that needs to sit on a VDI within Azure. Let's see if we can do some Citrix on Citrix and leverage that. And then also taking the opportunity as well, especially if you're coming from on-prem, to investigate technology such as layering, or especially as, MSIX app attach starts to go into GA, for example, thinking of like potentially repackaging or using things like the concept of like app virtualization with AppV, future state MSIX, and deliver that application dynamically as like an elastic layer, user personalization layer, or that net new type of application packaging that can help you address those minor app variances between personas. Now, how does this kind of map, especially when it comes to aligning that asset and inventory with Citrix Workspace? For example, like a call center persona. You've gone through and you've assessed those key sets of applications, and you've determined, hey, we're going to retire this app. Let's virtualize it on-prem. These other applications, that are going to be rehosted, we're going to locally install them within the VDI. And then thinking of Citrix Workspace as a whole, hey, we're going through a refactoring. We want to, reshape this application, stick app today. We're going to shift it and move it maybe towards web, or like look at replacing it with the SaaS apps and retiring it. That's where using things like Citrix micro apps, maybe extracting some of the key areas around, submitting PTO, going through a workflow into a micro app, which could be hosted as, single sign-on into Citrix Workspace app within your VDI. Again, using Citrix on Citrix, you can then deliver that app within the user experience, even though it's being, say, for example, refactored. And then other apps that are being rehosted, maybe it's a team lead, an application that's is maybe used only within 20% of the call center, and it makes sense. It's something we can elastically layer, or like allow them to put into like a user personalization layer, rather than having to double up, for example, your number of images. Let's leverage those to newer technologies that maybe we haven't had a chance to evaluate yet. But since we're rethinking what we're doing, maybe we can also change how we do a little bit of our image management today, to shift and consolidate and potentially simplify how we're doing our images from on-prem. Another great TechZone article that kind of talks through all these app evaluation methods, definitely something I recommend taking a look at following this session. Building along the planning phase, especially once you've gone through that initial rationalization effort, in the cloud adoption framework, one of the next big themes is forecasting and optimizing costs. Now, again, thinking of like on-prem and like where I've seen a lot of customers run into challenges is like thinking of like the same concept of how you've done sizing on-prem and just lifting and shifting that to the cloud. It does create natural inefficiencies. When you think of like sizing, for example, like Citrix workloads onto a physical asset, thinking of things like the rules of 5 and 10, hey, we're going to have very strict like overcommit ratios. We know we want to have like 100 VDI within this specific host, and we're going to assign our number of users, to that host. And really, we know it's a fixed asset. We're maybe not thinking about like each set of users, maybe 20% of them are like not really using all of it, but other 20% using a lot of the resources of their desktop and a few people in between. really to drive the most cloud efficiency, especially now that you're not captured by that paradigm of X number of hardware, X number of units per host, like let's size at the host level. You're much more flexible in terms of your sizing capabilities and ability to expand and contract. Taking a look at your historical data and actually trying to align users to more of a tiered services model is how you can drive greater efficiencies. So thinking, for example, of pulling resource utilization information from your director database, especially if the use case today exists in Citrix, or for example, using something like ControlUp or like Lakeside SysTrack, if maybe you're converting a physical asset into a virtualized VDI or user experience. Aligning those performance tiers, our users that are maybe using this a little bit lighter than others, let's try to shift them to multi-session. Use things like app layering, for example, where you take your single OS layer and then you have a different platform layer for multi-session, different platform layer for single session, and then leverage that benefit of WVD to drive some diversity. Going through this exercise of kind of realigning users based on performance is a great way to control and drive down costs. Just now, mileage may vary, especially when it comes to cost, but just thinking of just a basic exercise of 1,000 users, we have a 4x16 desktop today. We're just going to lift and shift and try to just repeat that sizing. What you're seeing on the screen is just SRP pricing, assuming just 24/7 running versus fluctuating, and there's a few other things when it gets into capacity sizing. But just going through that reevaluation, especially when it comes to 1,000 users of lifting and shifting, and maybe taking a look at current utilization and seeing that, hey, within our bell curve of utilization, thinking of the average, we can actually potentially shift a lot of these users to 2x8. Now, we don't want to do different types of VDI sizing within the same host because that can make it harder to control, harder to size, harder to maintain our CPU overcommit ratios and things along those lines. But that's out in the cloud. Let's make sure we align users to the performance that makes sense. Just going through this exercise on paper, right, and rethinking your current sizing, it can have a significant downstream impact on cost. And as you can kind of see from some of the numbers, and just going through the exercise and forecasting can make a difference. Another good example here is also storage. Thinking about current disk sizing that you may have on-prem. Hey, our standard is 200 gigs of disk. Now, when you kind of relate that and just try to lift and shift that to Microsoft, managed disks are sized, 128 gigs, 256, magnitudes of, 2 exponents, things along those lines. You're suddenly going to be paying, if you lifted and shifted that 200 gig disk, you're paying for 256 gigs per disk, even though you're not using it. And then also thinking how utilized were these disks? Maybe we had extra storage. We wanted to leverage our SAN array. Do we need 200? Maybe we can shift it down to 128. Looking at even those areas, especially when you start looking at, thousands of desktops, that can have, significant impact on, where your storage cost ends up as well. So I think if you take anything from this session, rethinking your current sizing, especially as you think towards Citrix at enterprise scale, is something that I would say should be part of any planning process when it comes to a current cloud project, especially if you have the luxury of existing data. So definitely rethink, doing anything Citrix of enterprise scale is rethinking your current sizing to better align with cloud benefits and paradigms. And building off of that too, and we kind of focused on sizing, it's also utilization and a better understanding current utilization, how that also maps to cloud concepts, especially with differences in pay-as-you-go or on-demand instances, is another great way to control and optimize your optimized costs for cloud. So thinking, for example, of your existing session timeouts, hey, we have users, we want a 3-hour idle time with maybe the screen popping up to lock them out, at least for security reasons, because we don't want them coming back and logging, having to re-log in and launch, say during lunch. And then after that, we're going to do a 12-hour disconnect time. Now, if you have timeouts like that for on-prem, it might not matter. You've purchased the hardware, for example. But when you suddenly bring it to cloud, that's going to impact your ability to train multi-session machines. And then you're also going to have something that's unused that's going to be up and running, that's going to impact overall total cost of ownership of the system. So taking a look at current session timeouts and trying to reassess how you do that today is a great way to also drive efficiencies. Hey, do we need a 2-hour idle? Maybe we're a little bit more aggressive and partner with our end user community to kind of highlight why we're doing this as a business. Hey, we're going to change this. It might, might have to log in again, for example, during lunch, but this is going to enable our business to allow you to do BYOD or able to work flexibly. I've seen a lot of customers, especially through the pandemic, like really, also look at how can we interface with the end user community and help them understand why we're doing this as a business to kind of fix areas that were, originally immediate, like hard pushback pieces. Like, hey, I don't want to wait for my VM to start up. I want it to be there right away. But you know what? I understand that waiting for it to start up is allowing me to use my Mac or be able to work from home. And it's helping the company, be green, save money, things along those lines. Understanding capacity requirements as well, especially when you think of like, should I reserve this instance or should I do pay-as-you-go pricing, Azure or otherwise? Looking at like, resource utilization data within Director, any other monitoring tools that can give you a good understanding of capacity and like looking at those peaks and valleys, thinking of the valleys being capacity that you're going to have up and running for long durations. For example, those are good indicators of like, what should you reserve versus what should you do pay-as-you-go on. And always like take the time, especially when it comes to like getting things going in the cloud, to like really try to understand your capacity needs, especially like how long over a calendar year do I need this? Is this a seasonal workload that's really just only going to be there 4 months of the year? Or should I just keep, should I reserve that? So like taking some time to understand your duration daily uptime before you reserve is okay. Maybe cost upfront initially once you get started will be a little bit higher, but then once you have the data from on-prem, validate your assumptions, it's something you can always do down the line, especially once you have better data at your fingertips. Hey, we know what families make the most sense for our tiered services model, et cetera. And then you can always leverage auto scale to kind of manage the differences with pay-as-you-go being the peaks, schedule-based policies, helping you understand and leverage those reserved instances. It's a great tool in your tool belt and can also help you manage changes in capacity demand by creating net new instances. Getting into like, funneling this into a cloud adoption plan, for example, thinking about, especially when it comes to workloads, again, having like vested states, really the biggest thing here is iteration. Trying to prioritize maybe the first 10 apps or like, first major Citrix use case, and then start creating a backlog of like, okay, who do we engage next? And now thinking of this adoption plan, and especially not being a victim of your own success, it brings us into the concept of an Azure landing zone. And like, what does that entail, especially when it comes to a Citrix environment? Landing zone design is really much like pretty much the core foundation of Azure. Think of it as like your compute network and storage and power, for example, within a physical data center. It's understanding areas around, okay, what's our Azure governance strategy? How are we going to make sure that teams adequately monitor, maintain, and leverage these resources in a way that's automated and policy-driven? What's our identity? How are we doing role-based access control, whether it be within the Citrix application and that overall team and the overall Azure platform? How are we going to connect this to our Azure data center? What are the instances we're going to standardize on if we're going to do reservations at an enterprise level? Like, for example, hey, we have web servers, like we're going to reserve a bucket of D series, and like, should the Citrix environment consume that as well? So thinking of like a landing zone, especially as you get to enterprise scale, really becomes modular, where you have subscriptions that align with given teams, specific business units. So that way you have a unit of scale that you can expand and build off of. So thinking of like, where does Citrix really fit into that? You'll have core subscriptions that define the platform, like your management subscription with things like log analytics, your connectivity subscription, which may give you that express route circuit that bridges your data center into your cloud, or your identity. Where are we managing things like security center, like other sorts of policies, things along those lines, or domain controllers, if you're building domain controllers within Azure. Citrix, especially for enterprise scale, if you're looking at, 500, plus machines, for example, you really should look at doing your own subscription. Because especially if you start lumping in something that can grow with like the rest of the organization, you're going to eventually run into limits that might compress that growth. So one of the things we typically recommend customers do up front is talk to their platform teams about having a dedicated subscription for a Citrix environment. And now we'll kind of explore a little bit of what that looks like. So thinking of like subscriptions or use cases that are like 1,000 machines or more, having that Citrix landing zone could be a combination of a single or like multiple subscriptions. Now, thinking of enterprise scale and, hey, single subscription's easy, that makes sense. We don't want to compress other business units because of subscription limits. Let's have our bucket so we can have our governance policies that apply to our application especially when you look at Azure design principles and things along those lines. We want to be able to have the space to succeed, to grow as necessary. Now, thinking of use cases, especially when you're in like 1,000 machines or more, whether it be large multi-session workloads or like a mix of multi-session and single-session workloads, it creates a concept of having like a Citrix shared service. So kind of like what you saw in the landing zone before, we had like enterprise shared services within their own buckets. Citrix, especially when you start looking at thousands, tens of thousands of users, having a similar concept within your Citrix landing zone makes sense. This is where your connectors are. Those connectors are then mapped to the appropriate resource locations, your ADCs for shared connectivity, for ingress and egress into Azure, as well as core file services, as well as image management. Being able to delegate out in a resource group, that master image, that app layering, that core shared image gallery set of components that you're going to be using for your images. That allows you to kind of delegate that out to your desktop team, your client team, in a way that you don't need to give them access to like underlying, for example, Citrix workloads or your workload subscription. And then thinking, for example, of like, okay, what's going to drive the most growth? That's going to be the workloads. That's where most of the machines are going to be within your Azure Enterprise Landing Zone. So having like a workload subscription, either maybe one for your multi-session VDAs, others for your single-session VDAs, this allows you to be able to kind of consider that subscription as a unit of scale. We know that every 1,200 VDAs, we're going to have to use, desired state configuration and, an automation pipeline that we can just pretty much take that template, copy, paste, create a new host connection, replicate our catalogs with PowerShell, and then you can grow much more agilely. Hey, let's start with one. Hey, we have a new use case. We're going through our build pipeline. Let's now build and scale that out. And then each of those workload subscriptions would represent your host connection with MCS. And taking this approach, again, aligns with some of the concepts in the cloud adoption framework around using a subscription as a unit of management as well as scalability based on your business needs and priority. So thinking of how this maps into a Citrix environment, especially if you were doing like, say, VDI across multiple subscriptions, each subscription would have its own catalog. You would then have like that master image for that catalog in your shared services sub, which you would then point, for example, to like capture within the shared image gallery and then distribute that out to your machines. Those would represent machine catalogs that you then aggregate into a single delivery group. Now, for those of you who are kind of looking again at smaller environments, especially if you're looking at like 1,000 machines or less over a multi-year timeline, this is not something that this may be over engineering, for example, especially if you're just getting started. So these are things that, especially if you kind of fight the fight to have Citrix in its own bucket, so you have a Citrix unit of management and scale, you may not need to do this like shared service, workload subscription, shared service subscription methodology. This is really the way that we're approaching 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 users, looking at Azure migrations for DR in the financial insurance, those, like a lot of those spaces driving a lot of interest in Azure today. So one of the concepts, and definitely recommend as we kind of finish this up, there's a lot of references that I'll provide towards the end of this that'll kind of help double click into some of these concepts. Next, going there from there, especially once you have that landing zone set up, again, doing it in a way that's scalable, modular, is going to allow you to kind of prevent you from being the victim of your own success. And I have seen a lot of projects, for example, where they lump too many use cases in a network that's not scalable, in a subscription management stream that's not scalable, where like the companies had to pause and say, wait a second, we can't move this use case because we can't scale our Azure properly. We haven't operationalized for it. So like as you go through this process, always take the time to like reassess as you're going through the migration process and optimize. Let's tweak our sizing. Let's go through a cost review quarterly. Did our sizing make sense? Should we readjust accordingly? Tweak our timeout policies, tweak our auto scale, maybe tweak our tiered service model, and then also make sure you kind of leverage some of the automated services through the process, things like Azure Policies, Azure Security Center, et cetera. And especially as you go through that adoption phase, leveraging the Citrix access layer, especially when it comes to that migration process, whether it be using things like site aggregation into Citrix Workspace. Hey, we're going to deliver our first foray into Citrix Cloud. Like, let's have it be on Azure. Let's not touch our on-prem environment yet today. Let's use like, hybrid licensing, for example. Let's, we can do some site aggregation into Workspace. Or for example, hey, we don't want to, let's optimize our management. Like, let's leverage Storefront. We're going to then aggregate our cloud management with our Azure workloads into your current state of like on-prem, and then eventually shift on-prem over. For those of you on the phone, especially if you've been with 6.5 migrations, any other Citrix migrations, like very similar methodology, especially when you talk about going to Azure, hey, getting everybody on Workspace app. I go to Workspace, I'm none the wiser where my application or desktop is coming from. Let's just now tweak levers based on AD group assignment or enabling and disabling overall workloads. And then some of the last pieces as well, especially when it comes to governance, Microsoft has a lot of great materials. I mean, we could probably do an entire 40 minutes just on Azure governance when it comes to Citrix. Definitely recommend digging into what governance means for Microsoft Azure, and as you go about this journey, building a Citrix governance MVP. So thinking of, for example, those multi-subscriptions that I mentioned, do we put them in a management group? Think of that as a bucket of subscriptions that align with a single team. Having what does prod and non-prod look like for subscription management? How should we just diversify our resource groups, which is just ways of aggregating those resources that fall in a subscription, and how are we going to tag them? Understanding some of these concepts, especially when it comes to your initial Azure design planning, is critical, because there's a lot of great ways for you to make sure you're following, least privilege. You're, applying automations like, hey, let's apply a policy to make sure we don't use this type of instance, because like that's what we've reserved, for example. So great thing to think about, as well as dig into some of the overarching concepts around Azure governance. And then finally, management, understanding what's your baseline around performance. We're looking at doing this instance type with these tiered services. How many users are we getting? What's our performance baseline? How is the express route being utilized? And then going about defining and creating that overarching project plan as you look at, building out your solution. What are your commitments in terms of like, what can we accomplish? How can we grow? How are we going to make sure we can support these workloads on the right time frame? As well as like, do we need to reskill our overarching team? So like, as you kind of take a look and, hopefully work from this conversation and dig into the cloud adoption framework, reskilling and managing for efficiency, because cloud is, forever evolving. Having those, key timelines and activities within your monthly, weekly, quarterly schedules to make sure you're kind of, hey, what's changed? Do we have new capabilities that are available to us? Do we need to reskill certain users now that we've moved our application to the cloud? Is definitely a key piece of your overarching migration process. Well, a lot of great resources out there. Definitely recommend taking a look. I created a blog series on a few of these topics that explore each of these areas in greater detail. Take a look definitely through part 1 through 4. And then there's a lot of great webinars that I've also done with Microsoft. But the biggest thing as well, like I mentioned, is really take a look at the cloud adoption framework. I think it's a great tool, and I always encourage like Citrix teams, especially, we tend to be the first use case that's going to drive a company to Azure, but especially when like things like infrastructure, DR, hitting new use cases, reaching new markets. So being able to speak the same language as your platform team is only going to help you be more successful. Because I do feel like, a solid Azure foundation is definitely key for Citrix success. But thank you all very much. And if there's, I'm going to be on the roundtable a little bit later. And if there's any questions, feel free to post them in the chat and I'll try to answer them quickly.
All right. Thank you so much, Kevin. Really appreciate you taking the time to present to our group. And as Kevin mentioned, he'll be in a roundtable discussion a little bit later, which is coming up here real quick. So StrataDesk is our next sponsor. And so take it away, StrataDesk.
All right. Well, thanks, Steve, and thanks, Kevin. This is Rich, and appreciate the fact that we were just talking about, the workload deployment and getting workload out to scale, right? So this is where we're going to talk a little bit about. Now we're going to talk about the endpoint and how do we manage those endpoints when those endpoints are connecting to those infrastructures that are in the cloud services. So first, just a quick, who is StrataDesk, right? So StrataDesk, we're a company that develops software for endpoints, repurposing endpoints, thin clients, those types of things, and then a management infrastructure to be able to manage those endpoints wherever they're deployed. So, we hear a lot about BYO, thin clients, repurposing PCs, those kinds of things. One of the things that we're finding recently is there's a big challenge regarding getting hardware for those endpoints, whether they be, from vendor A or vendor B, those kinds of things. And then organizations are having challenges of managing those endpoints being from disparate vendors. And that's one of the things that StratoDesk can help with, is the fact that we have the StratoDesk software that goes on the endpoints, so you can repurpose those endpoints, whether they be thin clients or PCs or laptops or et cetera, put the StratoDesk OS on them, and then use the StratoDesk management platform to manage those endpoints regardless of wherever they are. So hopefully everything's going correctly here. I think we got the slides going out. So now that we've talked about that, one of the next things that we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the cloud extension and the StratoDesk cloud extension. Let me get the slides going here. Oh. Sorry about that. So the StratoDesk cloud extension is what allows us to connect to the StratoDesk no-touch center and be able to manage those endpoints regardless of how those endpoints are deployed. The endpoints can be deployed in the infrastructure. They can be deployed at home. They can be deployed in mobile sites, wherever they are. So you can take the cloud extension and deploy the cloud extension with no touch center either being hosted in your data center, hosted in the cloud. We can host it for you. And then by using the cloud extension, you have the ability to have full control of those endpoints, regardless of where they're deployed. So you can have the ability to shadow them, reconfigure them, re-image them, all of those types of things. So again, regardless of where they're deployed, using cloud extension and the StratoDesk software, you can now then manage those endpoints regardless of whether they're thin clients, PCs, et cetera. So the next thing we're going to talk about real quick is I want to bring this over, and this is actually the no-touch center architecture. And I'm going to go ahead and log in. And once I'm logged in, again, the endpoints have the ability to report and they'll automatically enroll to the no-touch center using the cloud extension or using the no-touch center in the data center. And you have the ability to use all the different services for automatic enrollment, right? So in this case, I actually got it configured and set up such that anything that's using my internal network will automatically enroll into a group called My Devices. What this does is it gives you the ability to have hands-off deployability, even if those machines are outside of the network. You can use things such as email crossover or email service lookup so that the devices will report into the cloud extension, then report to the no-touch center, assignment policies and capabilities, have those devices report to the no-touch center, automatically report to a group, whether that group be a fixed group or a dynamic group based on the whether or not the user is moving around, and then have those configurations for your Citrix Workspace app automatically configured, automatically deployed to those devices. So it makes it truly so you can have hands-off deployability to connect to those workloads like Kevin was just talking about. Okay, so given the fact that we've only got 5 minutes, I'm pretty much going to wrap it up with that. But the thing to understand is that, like I said, with StratoDesk, you have the ability to repurpose PCs, repurpose or deploy other thin clients, bring multiple different thin client vendors into a single enterprise management platform, have a enterprise management platform that you can use with the cloud extension to have the ability to manage and control those endpoints regardless of whether they work from home, inside the infrastructure, across the globe, or mobile. Okay? So with that, Steve, I think that probably wraps up my 5 minutes.
Thank you, Rich. Appreciate that. So a couple of things. So we're getting ready to head into the roundtable's topics in just one moment. A couple of reminders. Passports are due now, so make sure you get those in for a chance to win a $100 Amazon gift card. I think we have 7 of them. So the roundtable sessions are on Zoom. You're going to choose a topic, and you can either come in on camera and audio or join the discussion or just sit back and listen. There's 4 sessions, so you'll click to join those from the lobby. And that's where we will head now.